This is the end. The good news is that Her Grace is coming back in the fall. Ta-da! And the reason I point in that direction is that at the end of May, I retire. After 8 years of doing this, I'm retiring. And she who is in charge is sitting over there in the corner. So full support and great happiness that Karen will be taking over the program. First rate, absolutely first rate. Now, we finish today with the title behind me. The war is coming to an end. And there are winners and there are losers. The winners don't have to tell a story, but the losers do. And that's where we are today. What are the stories for Laurinburg? General Sherman has walked his way through and gone north and left behind a loss. It's all over. It's done. And how do you accommodate losing? How do you define the story? And we're going to hear that today, and I'm going to be absolutely fascinated, having taken part in a losing war, because I learned to tell the story too. I'm so pleased, Dr. Martinez, that you're with us, but I'm always so pleased. Thank you, my dear.
Thank you so much. So our talk for today is really coming from a couple of the questions that people had on last week, when particularly about how did white women take this political identity of soldiers' wives and widows they were developing for themselves, how did they take that into the post-war period? But also what happens when the soldiers come home. Right? And of course, they start coming home during the war already. People who are very seriously injured or very ill or for other reasons can't continue start coming home, and we talked as well about deserters and people who are hiding out in the vicinity of home. Right? So some of this is a wartime story, and then it filters into the post-war period. But I think one of the questions we certainly would want to start with is, what does just the physical landscape of the South look like after 4 years of war? Right? It varies depending on where you are. Right? So there are places like this part of North Carolina that were relatively sheltered until the very end, right? But then had this swath of both, whether deliberate destruction or just the reality of 60,000 men on the march, come through toward the end. And so we have, fences have been taken down and vegetation removed or trampled, horses taken away, mules taken away, animals killed, food consumed at a just really massive rate right at the end of the war. Right? There are places that were battlefields for years or near battlefields for years, and so just had years of that kind of destruction and encampments and all of the sort of space that the Army takes up and all of the resources the Army takes up. There are places, if we think of Western North Carolina, where we don't think of being a battlefield, and yet there was, particularly in the last year or so of the war, constant, irregular, or what we would think of as guerrilla activity between Unionists and the Home Guard. And so there's the scars of war there as well, which maybe are more personal, right? Individual farms burnt by one side or the other, rather than, again, a big army coming through. We have places like the eastern seaboard of North Carolina that were occupied, and so their experience of Reconstruction started already in 1862, right? And what it means to be living with the other side. And again, that's the thing that both sides had to experience. So all of these realities of just what the place looked like. And then you have the deterioration, right? So if you don't have as many people around to do the work, you do the most necessary work and you don't fix everything, right? So stuff is crumbling because there aren't enough people to take care of it. The railroads are being damaged, either deliberately or just from years of overuse without the ability to fix them properly. Bridges need to be repaired. So there's just a lot of physical deterioration of the landscape and the infrastructure and the buildings So people are coming home to a place that has been damaged by war, and they are bringing all of the things that damaged them with them. We also have, for a lot of Confederate soldiers, just absolute shock at how quickly the war came to a close. And this is a good clue that they were not expecting it, right? That they were not, in the last month, seeing the end coming, because they are just flabbergasted that within a few weeks it all fell apart. Right? They thought they were close to winning in March and early April, and by May they've lost. And they're like, what happened? How did that happen? We don't understand. So they're bringing that confusion and disorientation into a landscape that is disoriented. Right? And then very quickly emerging the idea, coming away with this idea that for white Southerners, peace was not something they chose. It was imposed on them because they lost, right? They didn't win. They didn't achieve their goals. So what comes at the end of the war is something they did not want, and they have to figure out how to live with it or fight against it, or maybe both simultaneously. Okay? So peace is not necessarily, even if the return to home is welcome, right, the context in which it's happening is not. And that is also going to color people's experiences and their understanding of their experiences. So if we think about Civil War veterans coming home, and this is a late 19th century picture, but you get some sense of, I was trying to find a picture that sort of a veteran showing very clear physical signs of his amputation without it being like overkill. So I thought this one was good. Right, so we know very high rate of amputations in the Civil War, because the weaponry had advanced faster than the medical care, and people were coming into hospitals with, sections of limbs already missing, right, or holes so wide that they could not be repaired. And of course, you're concerned about infection and gangrene, and so the best thing to do is sort of cut something off and hope and treat for the best with what is left. Right? And of course, abdominal wounds were just so difficult to recover from. Most of those men didn't survive. So the men who survived were the ones who had the exterior, the limb wounds that could be treated. So huge number of amputees, right? I think we hear in the Ken Burns documentary that the state of Mississippi spent 20% of its budget in the 1890s on artificial limbs. Right? So the states in the South, by the 1880s and 1890s, begin building into the budget care for veterans, specifically disabled and sick veterans. And then also pensions emerge for widows. Right? But there's the emphasis at first is on men who had served, who had physical disabilities that were very visible, right? So amputees, people with sort of chronic wounds that remain needing to be treated, chronic illnesses that they picked up in camp. Other wounds that were less visible. They did not have a language for mental health that we have now, but you can certainly imagine that people came home with survivor's guilt, with some measure of post-traumatic stress that would have affected them. We see lots of reports talking about skyrocketing alcohol use, Valium and other drugs that they did not know just how addictive they could be, how dangerous they could be, that were sort of laudanum, things like that, just given in huge doses, and those high use and dependencies. So people talked about it, even if they didn't have all of the language we have to talk about it. You read it in the letters, right, of husbands who are not the person they used to be, or sons who went away to war and never quite came back, right, even if they're physically there. And then you have the men themselves, the veterans themselves, once they start kind of gathering and sharing stories, there's a lot of emphasis among veterans groups on caring for the veterans in their communities who are struggling to care for themselves, whether because of some really obvious physical issue or because of something nobody can quite see but everyone knows is there. Okay. So this constant sense of loss and the physical reminders of it are everywhere in these communities. So that this first statement, right, I don't recognize the place anymore, right? And then we'll hear people say, I don't recognize myself, I don't recognize the people around me, right? Everything has changed and we don't quite know how. And then you have, in many communities, right, the freed people, the formerly enslaved people, who are demanding to be paid, who are expecting to be negotiated with, right, who are willing to work in the fields but not to send their wives to work in your kitchen anymore. Right? Everything has changed. Right? And so the way labor works has changed, the way deference works has changed. If you're a member of the slaveholding class, you suddenly have workers as opposed to slaves. What does that mean? Everyone's trying to figure it out. Right? People have left. You have to convince them to come back. You have to pay them. You have to promise to put up a school and educate their children. If you're a member of the sort of middling class of farmers who didn't rely on slave labor regularly, you're still perhaps struggling to hire when you need extra hands, particularly if you or your son or someone who helped you run your farm was injured in the war. If you're a member of the lower class, now you have competition, perhaps, for jobs, right? Particularly not the lower class, but working class, right? So what we might think of as the artisan class or the working class, men who were carpenters, but also men who worked in factories. Can black men also do those jobs? Absolutely, they were doing them as slaves. Why can't they do them as free people? Well, now you're having to compete with them. Right? So everything has changed. This idea that people just do not recognize anything anymore is really, it touches every aspect of their lives. And the U.S. Army, right, the Bureau of Freedmen, Refugees, and Abandoned Lands is the official name of the thing we typically call the Freedmen's Bureau, is part of the Army. Right? It's set up by the Army as a way to deal with these three groups, right? So, or three things, right? So how do we work with the freed people? And a lot of it, the work with formerly enslaved people was focused on helping them negotiate contracts for their work, for their labor, and then make sure they got paid under the terms of that contract. But also, you know, the planters could go to them and say, hey, I have a contract with this labor and he's not showing up. Right? So both sides could use them for this purpose, negotiate and then enforce the contracts for a population for whom all of this was quite new. Right? The Freedmen's Bureau was also responsible for refugee resources and resettlement, so there are lots of white Southerners going to them as well for assistance. Right? And then all of the abandoned lands, right? And who gets them? Do they get sent back? Do they get returned to the people who abandoned them? Right? Or are there going to be plans to distribute them? Right? So initially, there's some sense that maybe that land will be distributed. So there are, in some places, U.S. Army officers and leaders and branches of the, you know, sort of symbols of U.S. government power. And then in other places, there's nothing. Right? So again, it really varies where you are living of whether or not you'll be expected to make some sort of loyalty oath. Right? The loyalty oath started during the war. So when the U.S. Army sets up in New Bern and Carteret County and that whole area, Craven and Carteret counties, lots of white Southerners take a loyalty oath that they will no longer support the Confederacy in order to buy and sell and you know, interact with the Union authorities to get their businesses up and running again. They sort of make nice with the occupying forces, and as I said last time, as the war progresses, they start to regret that decision, right, and become more and more resistant. A lot of people are in communities where they, you know, the soldiers, in order to be paroled and sent home after the surrender, have to say they're not going to take up arms again, right? That they will behave in a loyal manner to the United States government after this point, And they're also not supposed to wear their uniforms, right? They can take their guns home for the most part, horses, anything they brought with them. They're not supposed to wear their uniforms, but if they have nothing else to wear, they can, as long as they cut off any buttons or insignia, right? So the sense at the start of the piece, right, is get these men home as quickly as possible. It's May, let them get a crop in the ground so that the South can feed itself moving forward. Right? Let's get back to the status quo as quickly as we can. Right? So for a lot of men, that means, sure, I'll sign the oath, whatever you want me to sign, so I can go home. That doesn't mean I mean it, or that I'm gonna, that it really has taken root, right? It's coerced, it's required, therefore it's not particularly binding. Right? So there are overt and less overt acts of resistance, but again, it kind of depends where you are, what type of resistance is even feasible. Are you anywhere near a union authority figure to demonstrate resistance to, or do you just go back to life in a way that looks as much as possible like it did before the war, including how you treat maybe informally enslaved people around you? We'll get to that more in a moment. But this idea that, sure, I've surrendered because I didn't have a choice, but that doesn't mean I've really been defeated, persists for a lot of veterans. Right? And then we get to the topic of mourning. Some communities suffered absolutely catastrophic losses. Right? Everyone lost somebody. But there are places where they lost almost everyone. If we think about enlistment practices of forming a unit out of a community, right? This town is putting a company together, and if that company is at the forefront of a particularly brutal assault, right, you could wake up the next day and there are no young men left in your town. There are communities that really were devastated by the losses. And certainly, again, everyone lost somebody. What compounds that is the fact that your son, your brother, your husband, your lover, whoever, your friend, whoever it is, died far away. And you can't get their body back in most cases, right? Early in the war, it was easier to get bodies back, right? It becomes harder and harder as resources are more and more focused on fighting the war and not sending the dead home to families. Right? If you have private means, you have a better chance. So there's burial agencies created to try to keep track in some ways, but we're also thinking about like places like the Battle of the Wilderness, where, in the summer of 1864, were just massive, thousands of people fell within a few hours or a few days, and they're falling on a battlefield that was used a year earlier, and there's reports of like finding the bones of the people who died the year before when people are digging the field fortifications for these battles. So there's almost no ability to keep proper records. We have better record keeping and better sort of systemization systems for things in the Union Army, but it's mostly done by groups like the U.S. Sanitary Commission, right? So the Army sort of says, okay, you, mostly women, you can come in here and keep track of things for us and make sure we're keeping track of where the dead are buried so that their families can find out later. Right? And the Red Cross and groups like that. It's not the Red Cross yet. Is it the Red Cross? Yeah, it is. So like those groups exist, right? And the Union Army is kind of allowing them in a more formal capacity. Right? There's less of a plan for keeping track of this stuff on the Confederate side. So during and immediately after the war, people are trying to find out where their sons are buried. Right? Can they get their were they buried at all? Right? And if so, can they get their bodies back? Or can they at least make sure they're buried in some sort of official cemetery that sort of, if they're buried with other Confederate dead, if possible, if you can't bring them home. And so we have these women's burial groups that sort of spring up, fundraising for local communities, local troops, to go and get the bodies and bring them home, right? Or bury them properly in a cemetery where they are. Right? To pay someone to do that, of course. Right? So the prominent women of a community will get together, and eventually these groups start to be called Ladies' Memorial Associations, LMAs, in the Civil War memory lingo. These women, and very famously, one of the earliest sort of active burial moments is this group of women who gathered at Stonewall Jackson's tomb a year after his death to commemorate him. Right? But they're being formed all over the place, and usually not for famous men, but just for the men of a community. Sorry. Things keep popping up, and I'm trying to get rid of them, and I just move the thing around. Okay, so, and it's interesting that they call themselves ladies, right? We talked about that terminology last time. They are, in fact, turning public mourning into a political act. Right? But by claiming that they're doing it as ladies, that they're doing it as members of families, right? They are entering the public sphere, right, to demand things of government officials, to raise money, to hire workers, to purchase land, right, to build a cemetery, but they're doing it as grieving wives and grieving widows, grieving mothers, right, members of the private sphere. And so they're maintaining their moral purity, they're maintaining their status as true women, the things we talked about last week. Right? It's also less overtly threatening when women hold an event, right, attended mostly by women, but of course with a speaker who's a man, because it's not appropriate for women to be the public speakers, right? But they've hired him and paid him and given him thoughts on what he should say at this particular moment. I don't know if he took them. But when they go and they say things, right, like, they did not die for conquest, they died for duty, and that duty does not perish with defeat, right? They're going to start, slowly, covertly, and then more overtly, right, connect mourning to specifically sacrifice, right? The Confederate soldier's sacrifice of himself on behalf of his people, on behalf of his home, right? And those deaths need to be justified, right? Because they didn't win. Right? So the deaths need to be justified, and they need to be justified by celebrating the cause for which they died. Right? And again, it's a little less threatening when women do this, even if they do it in ways that seem very, they hold parades, they have a band, a military band to play at the parades, right? They're not hiding the fact that this is political and it is an act of resistance. But then if questioned about it, they can say, well, I'm just mourning my husband. Right? That's what I should be doing. Right? So you can kind of see it playing both sides. So what does defiance look like? And where does it turn to active violence? Right? So there's a lot of daily acts of violence. People refusing to take the oath. People refusing to request a pardon, right? If you were a high-ranking officer or you had more than 10,000 acres of land, you have to request a personal pardon. Right? People refuse to request them, say, I didn't do anything for which I need to be pardoned, so I'm not sending that letter. Andrew Johnson then just handed them out anyway to people who didn't ask for them. But some people, I refuse to accept the pardon, because again, I didn't do anything I need to be pardoned for. Right? A lot of day-to-day undermining freedom, undermining the Freedmen's Bureau, refusing to negotiate with them, refusing to sign the contracts, refusing to pay the people you've signed the contracts with, complaining that, the work contract stipulates this man is working on my farm. I thought that also meant his children were coming with them and he wants to send them to school instead, right? Or that, the things that were sort of expected in slavery are not happening anymore. And there's a lot of people, constantly complaining about that. We also see paramilitary violence, right? So we think of the Klan, but before then we have in South Carolina the red shirts. And again, similar to Sherman's men, I don't know that they're so picky about where the border is at all times. So I imagine some of their activity trickles into this part of North Carolina. Right? These groups are very focused on electoral violence, right? So targeting elected officials, Republican elected officials in particular, targeting black men who attempt to vote. Right? And this is 1865, 1866, right? So I think it's important to think about the timeline of Reconstruction, right? Is that the first 2 years after the war, there's very limited U.S. military presence most places in the South. Right? And technically, the only Reconstruction plan is this very broad wartime plan that Lincoln came up with that said 10% of the people in a community have to take the loyalty oath, and then you're good to go. Right? So there's a lot of people who don't take the oath, right? But the community is still technically considered loyal, right? And therefore not under military control and able to vote and participate. So they're doing things like electing Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, and trying to send him to Congress from the state of Georgia less than 6 months after the war ended. Right? And that's happening throughout the South. Of the same people who led the Confederacy are being chosen to lead again, which makes sense, right? They're the leaders of the community. Right? But if you're from the perspective of the U.S. government and from the perspective of Union veterans, this doesn't look like Confederates are saying, okay, we lost, right? It looks like they're saying, we laid down our arms, but we're going to try to figure out another way to win this thing, right? And we start to see as well, particularly very significant and kind of big ticket acts of violence against black political meetings, right? So African Americans cannot vote in any of these places in 1865, 66, and they start holding meetings in Richmond, in Memphis, in New Orleans, in any of the larger cities of the South. Right? Public meetings often led by black Union veterans saying, we fought for the United States, we should have the right to vote now that the war is over. And several of these meetings were attacked by white paramilitary groups who, again, are often wearing their Confederate uniforms, right? And reinstating their command structure that they'd had during the war. The Freedmen's Bureau agents are really clear about what they're seeing when they see violence against African Americans in particular, is that it looks like a Confederate unit, and you know, what is it, walks like a duck, looks like a duck, right? We're not calling it that anymore, but that's what's going on, right? So that's why in March 1867, Congress passes a Reconstruction Act that puts the South under much more explicit military jurisdictions, right? Carves it up. Each state is assigned to a military district, and military martial law will be instituted as needed, and the Army's coming back, right? Or coming to places it had never actually been, right? So there's almost 2 years where if white Southerners had been just a little less obvious in their resistance, they probably would have gotten what they wanted a lot faster. So where does that leave us then? So we have mourning, we have attempting to adapt or attempting to resist adapting, we have active violence as well as all sorts of other acts of violence. This brings us to the idea of the lost cause, which we're starting to see emerge in writings by the end of the 1860s, even though to some extent it's already in Lee's farewell message to his troops. Right? It starts in the cemeteries, though, being sort of political spaces of remembrance, spaces to remember sacrifice very quickly become sacred spaces. Right? And that mourning and justification hardens into an ideology that historians call the lost cause, in part because there's a book by Edward Pollard called, I think, The Cause Lost. Right? So what are the tenets of the lost cause? First and foremost, Confederate soldiers did not lose the war. Right? there's a couple different ways you can explain that, right? But above all else, right, a lost causer must avoid ever suggesting that the U.S. Army defeated the Confederate Army. Right? Something else had to have been happening here. So we get from Lee and from others early on, right? The United States had overwhelmingly larger resources in this war. They had more money, they had more people, they had the technology, and so they crushed the Confederacy by brute force and greater resources, and the Confederates never had a chance to win because of that overwhelming size difference here. Right? So it's the lost cause that begins creating this notion that Confederate soldiers knew from the beginning that they weren't going to win. Right? And that they were that much more honorable because they fought anyway. Right? If we look at what they were saying during the war, they thought they were going to win. Right? Again, right up until it was very clear they were not. Right? As they're abandoning Richmond, they start to think, okay, maybe this is unwinnable. Right? And you do see like half of Lee's army disappeared between evacuating Richmond and Appomattox. They're like, okay, it's clearly over. I'm going home. I don't need an official surrender to tell me what's going on here. Right? But until that point, right, people really thought they were going to keep going. Right? And even after that point, there are people who suggest they keep going. Right? So this idea that people didn't think they could win comes in afterwards, right? The justification. We knew it was a lost cause, but we fought anyway for duty, for honor, for home, and that makes it that much more brave and honorable that we fought, given we knew we were going to lose. Variations of this, most often the variation is the Confederate soldiers, the Confederate Army lost because of politics and the home front and lack of support. Betrayal from within, yeah. The Confederate Army died of the Confederacy died of a theory, right? States' rights killed the Confederacy. Zebulon Vance holding up supplies killed the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis fighting with and undermining his generals killed the Confederacy. Again, whatever it takes to avoid saying that the Confederate soldiers were in some way losers, right? Which makes sense, right? You have to both, if you lost somebody in this war, that's the last thing you want to say, right? And if you were a veteran coming home, that's the last thing you wanted to say out loud, even if that's maybe what you were saying to yourself. So that's tenet number one of the lost cause, right? Tenet number two is that slavery had nothing to do with it, right? And so we see as well in the lost cause this emphasis on celebrating the loyal slaves, right? Or avoiding talking about slavery altogether. Right? And these two things are linked, right? As we see, this sort of resistance and to the outcome of the war. So these ladies' memorial associations, the ones really early on invested in finding and burying, or at least properly marking the dead, right, lay the groundwork in the 1860s and 70s for what comes in the 1890s with the Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of Confederate Veterans and all of these groups, the monument building and the textbook arguments and things like that of the 1890s, early 1900s, 1910s are really beginning with the types of arguments that the LMAs were making. Right? As I said, these graves are not the graves of traitors. Right? They're also not the graves of losers. Right? We have to make that argument very clear over and over again. Right? The cause failed, the honor remains. Right? And that is really the mantra, right, of these memorial groups as they move forward. Right? And I didn't time this out because we're going to have a lot of extra time to chat, but that's okay. Right? And as we say, long shadows of all of this, right? The high point of that Civil War commemoration in the 1890s, 1900s, early 1910s, right up until World War I, is also what historians usually call the low point of American race relations. And I don't think those two things are unconnected. Right? In particular, there is an extent to which, in the 1890s, the U.S. veterans organizations that emerge basically accept the lost cause narrative of the war. And there is a bonding over shared veteran status, right, among white Civil War veterans, whether they're Union or Confederate, right, on having this experience that nobody else can understand, right, on having lived through the same war, and a war that looked, that the ideologies connected with the war, the language they used to describe why they fought, the day-to-day experience, the food, the armaments, the leadership, all looked very similar, right? And so that notion of the Brothers' War, right, paves the way for reconciliation among Confederate veterans and white Union veterans, right, on a shared decision to sort of accept the lost cause argument. Right? As Vance said, I do not accept the interpretation that was being promoted by the U.S. government in 1869. We're going to create a new interpretation, right? That lost cause interpretation, right? And I like this as well, right? That the story of the war will be written by those who remember it the longest. Not history is written by the victors, but history is written by the people with the longest memory. Right? We also think about the Civil War centennial in the 1960s, which some of you might remember parts of, right? Coincided with the most active phase of the American Civil Rights Movement. Right? And what happened is that a lot of the southern state governments really led the early centennial stuff in 1960, 1961. There was a secession ball in South Carolina. There's, a lot of our state historic sites from the Civil War era were put up in this centennial period with a very lost cause sort of description that is still there if you go to some of those older sites, that you can kind of see lurking underneath things. That became really unsustainable by 1963. There's two reasons why things became unsustainable in 1963. One is the Kennedy assassination, right? So once Kennedy is assassinated, they're just like, okay, we're not having any national celebrations in the next year, right? We're just gonna do what we can. The war in Vietnam is heating up. That also is a factor. So that any sort of federal government investment in Civil War commemoration collapsed at that moment. But also, it was just getting harder and harder to ignore the contrast, right, between the lost cause version of the story that was coming out of southern state governments and the very active resistance to southern state governments in the Civil Rights Movement, right? But this is, it's in the centennial, right? But specifically very shortly after a school desegregation order is given in 1962, that the battle flag goes up on the South Carolina State House. Right? So these things, again, are linked. Right? We had a sesquicentennial. That's a word we all had to learn. Sesquicentennial, 150th anniversary. I was a brand new, newly minted PhD when the sesquicentennial stuff got going. So I had lots of things to do. And there was a very deliberate attempt to tell a different story than a lost cause story. So North Carolina's State Archives and History Office was focused on telling a much bigger and broader and more inclusive story of the Civil War and commemorating rather than celebrating the anniversary of the Civil War. That was important as well. Where does that leave us today? I picked up this picture because this is one of the Sons of Confederate Veterans units in North Carolina in 2020, put up a giant battle flag on I-40 in the western part of the state, and their argument was every time a statue comes down, they're putting up a giant battle flag on an interstate. So that was their response, right? And there's, There's a really active Virginia flaggers group that's also involved in trying to put up these like just massive Confederate battle flags along interstates, particularly like right as you enter the state. So this question, right, of how is it still being discussed and debated and remembered, right, and all of the meanings that get attached to the symbols of the war in the aftermath continues, right? So it was kind of where I finished up, other than I gave you more book recommendations. Again, not suggesting anyone needs to go read all of these, so I will tell you a little bit about the topic. So Robert Bonner's book, Colors in Blood, is a nice, quick little history of the Confederate battle flag and how it gets used over time as a symbol. Fitz Brundage is one of the names often associated with the scholarship of the Lost Cause. So this is a fairly recent collection of essays from him, The Southern Past. It's all about race and memory. Karen Cox wrote Dixie's Daughters, which is about the United Daughters of the Confederacy and their role in creating this understanding of the Civil War and creating the Lost Cause. And then very recently wrote a new book on continued battles over what the Civil War meant, called No Common Ground. She kind of got, she was trying to leave the Confederate memory business, and she got sucked back in 2020. John Patrick Daly's The War After the War is a good, kind of short, again, overview volume of Reconstruction that's really focused on the day-to-day persistent violence of Reconstruction. So less about the laws and the top-level stuff and just what it was like to live through it. Jumping down to the bottom, Cadata Williams is telling the same story, but specifically from the perspective of the freed people, right? Whereas Daly tries to kind of bring in multiple perspectives, and Williams is really just saying, what was it like to be a formerly enslaved person living in Reconstruction? Like, really, what was it like? I mentioned Drew Faust last time, her book about women. This is her book about death and dying and rituals related to death and dying in the American Civil War. Carrie Janney's the expert on the Ladies' Memorial Associations, but she wrote a book specifically about them. But then recently she wrote kind of a big, comprehensive history of Civil War memory. Right? So if you want one place to go, I would go there. It's a big book, right? It's not a short read. But there's a little of everything. Kirk Savage's book, Standing Soldiers, Kneeling Slaves, is all about the monuments. It's an art history kind of book as much as a history book, and so a lot of detailed conversations about sculpture and monuments. And so, like, if you're interested in art history or you're familiar with it, might be great. It's a little technical. The overarching theme of it is great, but the sort of basics, the reading it closely is a lot of work if you're not an art history person. And then David Silkenat wrote two great books that are very focused on the first is very focused on North Carolina and North Carolina's refugee communities and populations in particular during the war. And then Raising the White Flag is all about what is the experience of surrender do to people, right? And what does it mean? And how does the concept of surrender and what happens in the aftermath of the surrender shape people's understanding of the war? So, some suggestions. Again, there's lots out there. Those are just a few that might be interesting. We have 10 minutes or so, which is more time than I usually give you for questions. So, questions, comments, thoughts?
If Lincoln had lived, would it have been different?
Yes, but I don't know how. This is a very common question, right? Hold on one second. So Lincoln set up a wartime Reconstruction plan, right? As I said, if 10% of the people swear the loyalty oath, right, they're good to go. Right? And he was planning to stick with that after the war. We know that. We also know that Lincoln changed his mind when he realized something wasn't working. He tried new things. Right? He was far less arrogant than Andrew Johnson. Right? So we have to assume Lincoln would have reacted differently to the events of 1865 and 1867. But knowing exactly how he would have reacted is much harder to predict. Right? He did publicly say toward the end of his life that African Americans, at least black veterans of the Union Army, should get voting rights, right, which Johnson really fought against. Beyond that, it's hard to know exactly what would have been different. Just that what we know about the two men suggests they would have acted differently. Right? But also, I mean, there's an extent to which we don't know how the U.S., how Northerners and Midwesterners and the sort of the U.S. population reacted to the end of the war, absent their reaction to their president being assassinated. Right? The surrender and the assassination happened so on top of each other that there's no way to understand what U.S. public opinion in early Reconstruction would have been without this public mourning for Lincoln. Right? So in addition to, and of course there's public mourning going on in northern communities as well. Right? The death toll may not have been quite so high, but the same experience of just absolutely, there were battles that took out all the young men in northern communities too. Right? There was catastrophic loss. And again, almost everyone knew somebody that they'd lost. Right? So we can talk about that, but so much of the public mourning in the North at the end of the war is tied up as well in public mourning of Lincoln. And initially there's this sense of vengeance that they want to enact on the South, right, that gets taken care of pretty quickly by the execution of John Wilkes Booth. But so it's hard to gauge what Northern public opinion during Reconstruction would have looked like if Lincoln hadn't been assassinated. Whether they would have gotten to the point they were in 67 quicker or slower, I don't know. Somebody might try to sort that out, but I don't know how you would do it.
Could you elaborate a little bit on how someone could have really believed that the war was not about slavery?
Well,
I mean, I know people.
so part of it, if we think about, like there's a historian in the 1890s, sort of the first wave of professional academics, as we might understand them. They'd gone to graduate school and taken seminars and were trying to ground their work in primary sources and legitimate things and not just like, oh, I heard this story from 6 people, so it must be true. Which is fine. Oral history is valid, but other things need to be there too. But the idea that they looked around in 1890 and they saw most African Americans in the country still living in the South, many of them living in horrific poverty as sharecroppers, right? Having very few rights, certainly not the right to vote anymore. They'd had it, they lost it. Things like the convict lease system, meaning slavery was being reinstituted in some ways, right? That for almost any infraction, black men would be put in prison and then put to work on the chain gang, black women to some extent as well, children being taken away from their parents on a regular basis, and looked at this and said, the situation of black people does not seem to be meaningfully better in freedom than it was in slavery. Right? So therefore, there would be no reason to fight a war for their freedom. Right? That's sort of the logic that people, I think, are going through, if they're thinking about it at all, right? Is that looking around in the late 1890s, freedom doesn't really look like it worked out all that well, so that probably wasn't why the war was fought. And again, that argument becomes harder and harder to sustain as we move through the 20th century. You can't make that argument anymore in the 1960s, so you have to find a new way. But that is, I think, at the height of the lost cause ideology. That's sort of where they're coming from. And then also, always trying to find the examples of the loyal slaves. Right? So we see states enacting pensions for camp servants and other slaves who could prove their loyalty during the war, their loyalty to the Confederacy, or at least to the planter class. And oftentimes they're doing that at the same time that they are creating laws that disfranchise black people. Right? So these ideas, again, are really linked. There you go.
I think it was the Virginia, I think his name was Taylor, who argued the difference of economy. Southern economy was agriculture, and northern was mercantile or capitalist, and there was we could never exist with one another. And he went down to Charleston to pull the lanyard and fire the gun.
Yeah. Yeah, and that argument starts in the 1830s and 1840s, right? That these two places were just so distinct from each other. That argument ignores reality, which is that most Northerners were also farmers. Up until the 1890s, the majority of Americans live on a farm. But it's 51% in some places and it's 91% in other places. So there are certainly differences. But yes, that's the sort of, there's other reasons. There's always, like, they're really through the 1950s and 60s, the mainstream academic historians bought this thing that the slavery wasn't the cause of the Civil War, right? For different reasons at different points in time. There's a lot of interest, as you might imagine, in the boom years of the 1920s and in the Depression in the 1930s. There's a lot of interest in economic history, because we're influenced by what's going on around us. And so the economic historians made this argument, right? That the North was industrial and the South was agricultural, and these two places could never live together, right? And so it was just a matter of time till they tried to come apart. Right? And also that we'll see them as well say slave labor would have died out eventually, because as places became more industrial, they would have gotten rid of slavery, which ignores the fact that they absolutely used slaves in the factories of the South. And that, again, distinguishing between degrees of exploitative labor in the America of the late 19th and early 20th century is challenging, but the status of a lot of factory workers didn't seem all that free or all that great, right? So we get that argument. And then in the 40s and 50s, there's a lot of interest in what we call the bumbling politicians school of thought, right? That the Civil War happened because we had a string of bad presidents and leaders in Congress who played to the extremes rather than looking for ways to compromise, right? And if the politicians had been better, we wouldn't have had the Civil War, which may be true, right? But it ignores the fact that the thing they were fighting about was slavery, right? They don't say that. They try not to say that. So yeah, that's sort of how that argument keeps getting made all the way into the mid-20th century. Other questions or thoughts? Yes? I am. Monument Avenue in Richmond. I have driven down, because when I was in grad school in Charlottesville, I went into Richmond to go to the State Archives all the time. And so, yeah, sometimes you go and drive down Monument Avenue. It's also close to the University of Richmond campus in that part of the town. So, yeah.
Well, know that at the rise of white supremacy, this country, the main horizon of the white supremacy, we all remember Charlotte.
Right.
So those monuments are all
Yes.
damaged, desecrated, and Monument Avenue is
Yeah, and I haven't been there since they took them down. I do know it's interesting because I think Civil War historians went through phases on this. Right? When I was in grad school and right out of grad school, so early 2000s to 2010 or so, generally the profession was saying, leave things up, but do more contextualizing, right? To explain it better, to explain why it was put here and what it was for. And over time, particularly when there was violence associated with the statues and very clear statements, more and more listening to African Americans saying, if we think about Chapel Hill, like black students for decades saying, walking past that statue makes it very clear that I'm not supposed to be here, and it scares me, right? And more listening to those voices and letting them kind of guide the conversation, I think is, by 2020, historians, a lot of Civil War historians were really excited to see people taking that contextualization into their own hands. So Karen Cox, for example, on the cover of her book, has the base of the Lee statue with the projection of George Floyd's face on it and saying, like, all right, here's your context. Here's what these things mean. These are not separated. They're very intentionally connected. So yeah, I haven't been there. I haven't been in Richmond in years. I was supposed to go a couple summers ago, and I didn't because I got sick. So I haven't seen it since they've taken things down. But I know, again, it was not every historian agreed. Certainly it was political conversation. In North Carolina, there's a law that says you can't take things down. We still took some of them down. I think historians generally are not in favor of laws that say one interpretation of history is written in stone now and for all time, because we know that we have changed our minds about things, right? So I don't think we're in favor of the law. Even people who would want the statutes to stay up don't think it should be written into law the way it is. So there's a lot of disagreement on it.
I must say that the city of Richmond, I'm very proud of the fact that they accepted the riot, they cleaned up the monuments, and Richmond did not respond with riots.
Yeah.
I think that is a testament to our country.
And I think to very deliberate choices that were made by leadership in Richmond, going all the way back in, like, they were very invested in Richmond in 2010 in the sesquicentennial, in telling a story of the Civil War that included everyone, that everyone who currently lived in Richmond could see their history reflected in some way, that I think is part of a kind of consistent approach to doing history in Richmond. And particularly if you talk with like people at the Museum of the Confederacy, they say the article is important there. It's the Museum of the Confederacy, not the Museum for the Confederacy, right? And how we tell the story reflects those things, and how Richmond tells the story of its history. And they worked closely with historians, but also with descendant communities of all varieties to try to tell the Civil War story in those 5-6 years that I think set them up 5 years later to make the decisions they made and have the outcome be less aggressive and deadly than it was in some places.
And I'm sure the same can happen in other cities in the South.
Yeah. All right, that's it.
Jamie, as always, a privilege, an absolute privilege to be with you and to learn. The next time we get together for lifelong learning will be the 10th of March. I woke one morning and reflected on the fact that St. Andrews used to be, but isn't anymore. And what does that mean? And so, talking to Mac, I have invited the president of Coker College to come here on the 10th of March and to talk to us about strategies for the successful liberal arts college. What can we do that is right to keep these absolutely critical and crucial institutions going? And Natalie Harder is the 17th president of Coker College, the first female. She looks like she's 16. She acts like she's 50. She is absolutely magnificent, and through the good offices of MacDoubles, we've gotten her here. So the 10th of March at 11 o'clock. Friends, go in peace. Outstanding.